Right now, you are paying over $4 a gallon at the pump. 6 weeks ago, you were paying under $3. The difference is a 5-mile-long coral island in the Persian Gulf that most Americans cannot find on a map, and that island just got bombed for the second time in 4 weeks. Kharg Island is Iran's economic jugular. 90% of Iran's crude oil exports flow through this single terminal before entering the global supply chain through the Strait of Hormuz. On April 7, U.S. forces struck military targets on the island again, days before a fragile 2-week ceasefire that is already fracturing. Oil crashed 16% on ceasefire headlines. Then it climbed right back above $97 within 24 hours, when Iran accused the U.S. of violating the agreement. Here's what you need to understand. This is not a story about a war happening somewhere far away. This is the story of why your grocery bill changed, why your commute costs more, and why the inflation number you saw this week, 3.3%, the highest since mid-2022, traces directly back to a place smaller than Manhattan. And the ceasefire everyone is celebrating? It has a 2-week expiration date. What happens after that is the real story. The path to this moment runs through 3 decades of unresolved tension, but the timeline that matters starts on February 28, 2026. That is the day the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iranian military sites. Within 72 hours, Iran responded by effectively shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile-wide corridor that carries 1/5 of the world's traded oil. The strait closure triggered the largest disruption of crude supply in modern history. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain collectively shut in 7.5 million barrels per day of production in March because they had nowhere to send it. Storage facilities across the Gulf filled to capacity. Tanker traffic through the strait dropped to single digits per day, down from hundreds. On March 13th, U.S. warplanes hit over 90 military targets on Kharg Island, missile storage, naval mine depots, air defenses. Trump announced the strikes publicly and added a specific warning. The oil infrastructure was spared deliberately, but that decision could be reversed at any time. That threat alone sent Brent crude above $110 a barrel. Then, on March 29th, Trump told the Financial Times something that changed the calculus entirely. He said the U.S. might seize Kharg Island outright. 5,000 Marines deployed to the Persian Gulf the same week. But this is where the story changes, because what looked like escalation suddenly became negotiation. And the terms of that negotiation tell you more about what comes next than any ceasefire announcement. On April 7th, U.S. forces struck Kharg Island a second time. Military targets again. Oil infrastructure untouched again. The pattern is deliberate. Washington is sending a calibrated message. We can destroy your economy overnight, and we are choosing not to. That is not restraint, that is leverage. Hours later, with less than 2 hours remaining before Trump's deadline to obliterate Iran's power grid and bridges, Tehran accepted a 2-week ceasefire. Iran submitted a 10-point proposal. Trump called it a workable basis for negotiation. Markets erupted. The Dow surged 1,325 points, its best single day in a year. WTI crude collapsed 16.4% to $94 a barrel. The S&P jumped 2.5%. Asian markets followed. South Korea's Kospi gained nearly 7% in one session. But this is where the story changes. Within hours of the ceasefire announcement, Iran's parliament speaker accused the U.S. of 3 violations: Israeli strikes continuing in Lebanon, a drone entering Iranian airspace, and rejection of Iran's right to enrich uranium. Israel's Netanyahu stated explicitly that the ceasefire does not apply to Lebanon. Iran responded by halting tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz again. The ceasefire is technically holding. The oil is technically not flowing. Only 4 ships passed through the strait on the day the ceasefire was announced, fewer than the day before. And Iran has begun charging vessels up to $2 million per transit for safe passage. That fee alone adds roughly $1 to every barrel moving through the corridor. This is the part most analysts are missing. The ceasefire did not solve the supply crisis. It paused the bombing while the supply crisis continues. Kharg Island is not just an oil terminal. It is the single point of failure for Iran's entire economy and one of the most consequential pieces of real estate on Earth. A 1984 CIA document described the island's facilities as the most vital in Iran's oil system. 4 decades later, nothing has changed. Iran still routes 90% of its crude exports, approximately 1.5 million barrels per day, through this one location. Most of it goes directly to China. The strategic geometry here is precise. Kharg sits 15 miles off Iran's coast in deep water, one of the few locations in the shallow Persian Gulf where supertankers can actually dock. That geography made it an oil terminal in the 1960s. That same geography now makes it a military target that cannot be replaced. Iran has no backup. During the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein bombed Kharg repeatedly, and Iran was forced to reroute exports to smaller facilities at Lavon and Siri Islands. Those facilities handled a fraction of the volume. What structurally changed on March 13th is this. The United States demonstrated it can neutralize Kharg's military defenses without touching the oil. That creates a new dynamic. Washington now holds a switch it can flip at any moment. Destroy the terminal, and Iran loses its primary revenue source. Seize it, and the U.S. controls the flow directly. Hold that thought, because what comes next changes everything. The question is not whether the U.S. can take Kharg Island. The question is what happens to the price you pay for everything, if it does. The decision-making in Washington right now is not about Iran. It is about oil price management during a political cycle. Every move the administration has made on Kharg Island follows a single logic. Maximize pressure on Tehran without triggering an energy price spike that turns American voters against the White House before midterm elections. That is why the oil infrastructure remains untouched after 2 rounds of strikes. Destroying Kharg removes 1.5 million barrels per day from global supply permanently. Goldman Sachs projects that if the Strait of Hormuz stays restricted for just 1 additional month, Brent crude averages above $100 for the rest of 2026. The EIA forecasts gasoline peaking at $4.30 per gallon in April. Destroy Kharg, and that number becomes a floor, not a ceiling. The seizure option carries a different calculus. Occupying the island puts U.S. troops on a stationary target 15 miles from the Iranian mainland, within range of every drone and missile in Iran's arsenal. Former White House Situation Room Chief Mark Gustafson warned it would become a multi-week magnet for Iranian strikes. Iran has already signaled it would consider destroying the oil infrastructure itself before allowing the U.S. to control it. That is not a bluff. Iran did exactly that to Kuwaiti oil fields through proxy during the Gulf War era. The real strategy is neither destruction nor seizure. It is indefinite threat. Keep Kharg intact, but defenseless. Keep the Marines offshore, but visible. Force Tehran to negotiate under the constant knowledge that its economic lifeline can be severed in a single sortie. This is the part most people stop the analysis at. That is the mistake. Because Iran has a counter-strategy, and it is already working. But the other side tells a different story. Iran's position is that the Strait of Hormuz is sovereign territory, and Tehran has every right to regulate traffic through it, including charging transit fees and deciding which vessels pass. From Iran's perspective, the ceasefire is not a concession. It is a demonstration that Iran holds the stronger card. The U.S. can bomb military installations. Iran can shut down 20% of global oil supply with a single order. The numbers support the argument. Since February 28th, Iran has brought the world's energy markets to their knees without firing a single missile at a foreign oil facility. It simply closed a door. Oil surged 50% in March alone, the steepest monthly rise in recorded history. Global shipping rerouted. Gulf producers shut in 7.5 million barrels per day of production because they physically could not export it. Iran proved that it does not need nuclear weapons to hold the global economy hostage. It just needs geography. Tehran is now charging up to $2 million per vessel for straight passage. Iran's Supreme National Security Council declared this gives the country unique economic and geopolitical standing. Analysts at BCA Research warn that even if the ceasefire holds, Iran has solidified its political control and demonstrated its capacity to paralyze global energy flows at will. Here is the precise gap in that argument. Iran's leverage is a one-use weapon. Closing the strait devastates Iran's own export revenue simultaneously. Before the war, China was buying 1.5 million barrels per day from Iran through Kharg. That revenue stream is now frozen. Iran's economy is bleeding alongside everyone else's. The longer the strait stays restricted, the more Iran's own bargaining position erodes, because a regime that cannot fund itself cannot sustain a prolonged standoff. Here is where this lands in your life. The national average for a gallon of regular gasoline hit $4.12 this week. 6 weeks ago, it was $2.81. That is a 47% increase in under 2 months. In California, drivers are paying $5.93. In Los Angeles, some stations are posting $7.19 per gallon on credit. The national average has not been above $4 since August 2022, and the EIA projects it climbs to $4.30 before it stabilizes. The fuel cost is only the surface. When oil crosses $100 a barrel, transportation costs ripple through the entire supply chain within 72 hours. Grocery prices follow within 2 weeks. That is not speculation. That is the documented supply chain timeline from every previous oil shock on record. March CPI data confirmed it. Inflation surged 0.9% in a single month, the largest jump since June 2022, pushing the annual rate to 3.3%. Gasoline accounted for nearly all of it. Diesel is worse. Prices are approaching $5.80 per gallon nationally. Every product that moves by truck, which is nearly everything you buy, now costs more to deliver. Delta Airlines announced it expects to spend an additional $2 billion on jet fuel this quarter alone. That cost gets passed directly to ticket prices. Borrowing costs compound the damage. The Fed warned in its March meeting minutes that a protracted Middle East conflict could force additional rate adjustments as higher oil prices erode household purchasing power. Mortgage rates, auto loans, credit card interest, all of it sits downstream from this single choke point in the Persian Gulf. One island, 15 miles of coral, and your monthly budget just restructured itself around it without your permission. 2 scenarios, 2 timelines. Both start with the same question. Does the ceasefire survive its 2-week window? Short term, next 30 to 60 days. Negotiations move to Islamabad under Pakistani mediation. The U.S. brings a 15-point framework. Iran brings its 10-point proposal. The core issues are uranium enrichment, sanctions relief, and Strait of Hormuz governance. The gap between those positions is enormous. BCA Research's chief geopolitical strategist projects fighting reignites later this month, if not later this year, specifically because the U.S. will not accept Iran as permanent gatekeeper of the strait. If the ceasefire collapses, oil retests $110 within 48 hours. Gas prices push past $4.50 nationally and approach $5 in high-cost states before Memorial Day weekend. Midterm, 3 to 6 months. The de-escalation path requires Iran to fully reopen the strait without transit fees, resume normal export operations through Kharg, and accept limits on enrichment. In exchange, Tehran wants sanctions relief, economic compensation, and U.S. withdrawal from the region. If that deal materializes, oil drifts back toward $80 by late summer, and gas prices settle near $3.50. The probability is low. Neither side has incentive to concede its primary leverage before the U.S. midterm elections. The escalation path is simpler. Israel continues striking Lebanon, Iran declares the ceasefire void, the strait closes again. The 5,000 Marines currently offshore receive orders to secure Kharg Island. Oil spikes past $120. Gas hits $5 nationally. The Fed faces an impossible choice between cutting rates to protect employment and holding rates to fight energy-driven inflation. That scenario breaks something in the economy that does not repair quickly. The pattern is clear. Every major oil disruption since 1973 followed the same sequence: geopolitical shock, supply restriction, price spike, inflation surge, consumer contraction. The only variable is duration. And right now, duration depends entirely on a 2-week ceasefire that both sides are already calling broken. One island controls the timeline, and the clock is running. If this breakdown gave you clarity that the headlines did not, subscribe now, because the next development on Kharg Island will move markets before it moves the news cycle.